In this lecture, we're going to discuss the first major division of the nervous system called the central nervous system. The central nervous system consists of two organs. The first organ is the brain. The second organ is the spinal cord. There are two types of neuronal tissue found in the central nervous system. The first type is called gray matter, and gray matter consists of cell bodies and dendrites. The second type of neuronal tissue is called white matter, and white matter consists of myelinated axons. Looking at a cross-section of the spinal cord, the dark inner brown area that you see that resembles a butterfly, that's gray matter. And the surrounding area around that butterfly, that would be white matter. Next, taking a look at a cross-section of the brain, you can see that the outer part of the brain consists of gray matter, and the inner part of the brain consists of white matter. Surrounding the organs of the central nervous system is a connective tissue covering called the meninges. And the function of the meninges is to surround and protect the brain and spinal cord. The meninges are composed of three parts. The first part is called the dura mater. The dura mater is the toughest, thickest, strongest connective tissue surrounding the brain. It's also the outermost connective tissue surrounding the brain. The second meninge is a thin spider web-like connective tissue called the arachnoid mater. And the third type of meninge is very thin. It's tightly bound to the surface of the brain and spinal cord, and that's called the pia mater. Within the brain are fluid-filled cavities called ventricles. And the function of ventricles is to create and circulate a substance called cerebral spinal fluid. Cerebral spinal fluid is a fluid that's produced in the choroid plexus located in the ventricles. The function of cerebral spinal fluid is to bathe, protect, and nourish the central nervous system. Next, we take a look at the first major organ of the central nervous system, which is called the spinal cord. The spinal cord originates at the foramen magnum and ends at lumbar vertebrae number 2 before fraying and becoming the cauda equina, or horse's tail. Taking a look at a cross-section of the spinal cord, we can see that the spinal cord consists of several parts. The first part is called gray matter. Remember, gray matter is nothing more than cell bodies and dendrites. The second part is white matter. Remember, white matter consists of myelinated axons. The third part is the central canal. The central canal is where cerebral spinal fluid passes through. The fourth part is called the dorsal root. And the dorsal root consists of axons of sensory neurons. The fifth part is called the dorsal root ganglion. And the dorsal root ganglion is a collection of cell bodies of sensory neurons. And finally, the last part of the spinal cord is called the ventral root. And the ventral root consists of axons of motor neurons. A neural pathway that includes the central nervous system is called a reflex. And a reflex is an involuntary reaction in response to a stimulus applied at the periphery and transmitted to the central nervous system. We're going to talk more about reflexes in a future lecture when we discuss the peripheral nervous system. The last major organ of the central nervous system is the brain. And some people consider the brain the most complex thing in the universe because of the multitude of things that it can do. And there are four major regions of the brain. The first region is called the brainstem. The second region is called the cerebellum. The third region is called the diencephalon. And the fourth region is called the cerebrum. Taking a closer look at the major regions of the brain, the first major region we're going to take a look at is called the brainstem. And the brainstem consists of three parts. The first part is called the midbrain. The second part is called the pons. And the third part is called the medulla oblongata. The first part of the brainstem that we're going to talk about is the midbrain. The midbrain is superior to the pons. It acts as a relay between the spinal cord and cerebrum, or acts like a relay between the cerebrum and spinal cord, or cerebellum. The midbrain is also a relay for the auditory nerve pathway and controls visual reflexes and certain eye movements. The second part of the brainstem is the pons, and the pons is found between the midbrain and medulla oblongata, and serves as the relay between the cerebrum and cerebellum, and is involved in controlling breathing, swallowing, balance, chewing, and salivation. And the last part of the brainstem is the medulla oblongata. The medulla oblongata is located between the pons and the spinal cord. It's involved with the regulation of heart rate, blood vessel diameter, breathing, swallowing, coughing, balance, and coordination. An area in the front of the medulla oblongata called pyramids contain nerve tracts from the brain to motor neurons in the spinal cord and are involved in the control of skeletal muscle. The next major region of the brain is called the cerebellum. And the cerebellum is posterior to the brainstem and inferior to the occipital lobe. Its cortex consists of gray matter, while internally it's composed of gray nuclei and white nerve tracts. The cerebellum is responsible for balance, muscle tone, and the coordination of fine motor movement. The next major region of the brain is called the diencephalon. And the diencephalon has two parts. The first part is called the thalamus, and the thalamus serves as a relay between the brainstem and cerebral cortex. It is associated with mood and pain. The second part of the diencephalon is called the hypothalamus. The hypothalamus maintains homeostasis and regulates body temperature, hunger, thirst, pleasure, relaxation, secretion of hormones, and other emotional responses. The last major region of the brain to discuss is the cerebrum. The cerebrum is the largest part of the brain, and the cerebrum has several surface anatomy structures to identify. The first surface features are these shallow grooves found on the surface of the cerebrum. These shallow grooves are called sulcus, or sulci for plural. And there is one major sulcus to identify, and that's called the central sulcus. The next outer surface feature of the cerebrum is called the gyrus, or gyri for plural. Gyrus is the brain matter found between sulci or sulcus. And there are two major gyri. The first one is called the precentral gyrus, which is located in front of the central sulcus, and the second one is called the postcentral gyrus, which is the gyrus located behind the central sulcus. The next surface feature is the lateral fissure. A fissure is deeper than a sulcus. The lateral fissure separates the parietal lobe from the temporal lobe. And finally, the last feature seen from a superior view is called the longitudinal fissure. The longitudinal fissure separates the cerebrum into left and right cerebral hemispheres. There are four major lobes of the cerebrum. The first lobe is called the frontal lobe. The second lobe is called the parietal lobe. The third lobe is called the temporal lobe. And the fourth lobe is called the occipital lobe. Looking at the inside of the cerebrum is divided into two major areas. The first area is called the cerebral cortex. And the cerebral cortex is the outer portion of the cerebrum that consists of gray matter. The second major part of the cerebrum is the corpus callosum. The corpus callosum is a band of white nerve fiber tracts that allows the left and right cerebral hemispheres to communicate with one another. In terms of its function, there are two major areas of the cerebral cortex. The first area is the motor area. The second area is the sensory area. Note, area and cortex can be used interchangeably. Within the motor area, there are three major sections of the cerebral cortex. The first section is called the primary motor cortex. The primary motor cortex controls voluntary muscle movements and creates the voluntary commands for skeletal muscle action. There's a specific area within the primary motor cortex that is responsible for motor speech called Broca's area. The second section is called the premotor area, And the premotor area organizes motor functions before initiating them. And the last area is the prefrontal area. And the prefrontal area is responsible for motivation and regulation of emotional behavior and mood. Within these sensory areas, there are two major sections of the cerebral cortex. The first section is called the primary sensory areas. And in the primary sensory areas, these are the locations where sensations are perceived. And there are 5 primary sensory areas, one for each of the 5 special senses. The first primary sensory area is called the primary somatosensory cortex, and this is responsible for the sense of touch, pain, temperature, and pressure. The second sensory area is the visual cortex. The visual cortex is responsible for the sense of sight, or vision. The third sensory area is the auditory cortex, and this is responsible for the sense of hearing. The fourth sensory area is called the taste cortex, and this is responsible for the sense of taste. And finally, the last sense area is the olfactory cortex, and the olfactory cortex is responsible for the sense of smell. The second section of sensory areas are called association areas. And association areas are the location where perceived sensation is processed for recognition. An important association area is called Wernicke's area. Wernicke's area is the area of the cerebral cortex where interpretation of written and spoken language occurs. On this diagram, we're going to identify the different sensory and motor areas of the cerebral cortex. The primary motor cortex lies just in front of the central sulcus. Just inferior to the primary motor cortex is Broca's area. And in front of the primary motor cortex is the premotor cortex. And in front of the premotor cortex is the prefrontal cortex. Now taking a look at the primary sensory areas, the first primary sensory area is the primary somatosensory cortex, which is located behind the central sulcus. The visual cortex, the auditory cortex, the taste cortex, and the olfactory cortex. And finally, the association areas, which are located behind the primary somatosensory cortex. So how are the motor and sensory areas of the cerebral cortex mapped out in regards to the human body? Well, if you take a look, starting from the top of the cortex, you can see that both sensory and motor begin with the lower appendages. And then from the lower appendages, they work their way down to the upper appendages and the face. And for the sensory areas, it carries down into the abdominal area.